A fleet of Chinese ships en route to the Horn of Africa, on a mission to set up China's first overseas military base in Djibouti. China says the base will be used to support peacekeeping and relief missions.
The establishment of the base will help Chinese vessels escort missions in the Gulf of Aden and Somalia, and international obligations such as humanitarian rescue missions. It helps China to continue to make even greater contributions to the peace and stability of Africa and the rest of the world.
Construction began on the base last year. Although small, Djibouti is strategically placed, sitting on a busy shipping route and a stable country in an otherwise volatile region. China now joins the ranks of several other nations with military bases in Djibouti, including the US, France and Japan. But China's new base and rapid modernization of its military is raising alarm bells for neighboring countries, particularly India, with concern this base could become another one of China's so-called string of pearls, building up strategic military alliances and sea lanes in the region.
Africans will continue to strengthen this partnership with China, perhaps to the detriment of other countries. And this lack of balance is not the Africans' fault. Africans have been waiting for long decades for Europeans and others to come and support them in the development process. And now it's China doing it.
China's military base is being seen as the latest move in its mission to project both hard and soft power. As well as military expansion, China has ramped up its investment in Africa in recent years, becoming the continent's largest trading partner and funding major infrastructure projects. In 2015, it pledged to invest $60 billion in Africa's development. Are China's actions in Africa a kind of modern-day colonialism? Or is it simply playing catch-up to other powers and rebalancing strategic military interests? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now by Bill Gertz in Washington, D.C. He's a senior editor at the Washington Free Beacon. And in London, Ibrahim Al-Bakri Niay. He's an African researcher and political observer at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Bill, let me begin with you, sir. Is this a game changer, this Chinese move?
Yes, I think it is. I think that basically this is a growing Chinese military power projection. This is the first Chinese overseas military base. Beijing doesn't want to recognize that. They call it a support base for their regional activities. But clearly, China wants to project military power, and they're developing military forces to be able to do that, especially naval forces. Including the development of new submarines and new ballistic missile nuclear submarines. So I see this base as a threat.
Ibrahim, is this the beginning of China switching on military empire mode?
Well, I think that this is the advanced stage of Chinese engagement with Africa, or to a larger extent, the war as a whole. And this phase of Chinese engagement is really motivated by the extent to which China had advanced in Africa in terms of trade, cultural diplomacy, and infrastructural diplomacy. And we've seen patterns of such over the last 50 years that developed countries or permanent members of the UN Security Council that are making advancement in the developing world. They use military, they use foreign aid, they use the economy. So we are not surprised that China is today reaching out with military engagement in Africa.
And Ibrahim, as many people ask when it comes to economic engagement or business engagement or China buying farms in Sudan, for example, they always ask the question, is it going to help or harm Africa? So with Djibouti being strategically positioned in the Horn of Africa, is this going to help or harm Djibouti and the region as a whole?
Well, it depends on the extent to which the Djiboutian authority respond or accept the Chinese engagement. China today is among the countries with the highest volume of trade with Djibouti, accounting for about $2 billion in input to Djibouti. And so how the the Djiboutian authority respond to the Chinese engagement in terms of the economy and even the military base, which is about 100 million a year. So the Djiboutian economy or the Djiboutian authorities largely see this in terms of economic development, in terms of access to more revenues. But the implications for future peace and stability is yet unknown. And so we have to observe this pattern.
Right.
So if there's actually a threat, I think the threat should be more considered in the context of Africa. How does the U.S. and how does the U.S. base in Djibouti and how does the Chinese base in Djibouti respond to threats in the African continent? So we should look at the threat that all of the bases, the three permanent members of the Security Council, U.S., France, and now China, that are establishing military bases in Africa, we should look at the threat it poses to peace and stability in Africa,
but Ibrahim,
rather than seeing what threats.
Certainly,
Yeah.
if they can come together and help defeat, for example, Al-Shabaab in the Horn of Africa, wouldn't that be a good thing?
Well, yes, of course, Somalia, with the entire African continent, want peace in Somalia. We want peace in the entire Horn of African region. We want the end to piracy. Piracy has significantly affected the marine trade. And so if the world forces that are emerging in Djibouti, if they can work together to support the Somali authority, the Kenyan authority, and the Ethiopian authority to defeat Al-Shabaab, to end piracy, then we'll be talking about a new engagement in international affairs, rather than the continuous exploitation of African resources and the continual engagement of African leaders on the basis of inferiority and superiority from world leaders. So we look forward to more African interest in these engagements rather than what interest it serves for the U.S. or what interest it serves for China. And the greater African interest is in the interest of the entire world and the United Nations. Somalia has been a major threat. I mean, let me say Al-Shabaab has been a major threat to the entire piece of the East African region. And so if the world powers can succeed in supporting the local authorities in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya to defeat Al-Shabaab, then we can say the engagement is positive.
Right.
But for now, it is largely couched in the interest of these world powers.
Okay, Bill Gertz, this Chinese military base, just a few miles away from Camp Lemonnier, the US base, is that an opportunity to work together, or is the United States freaking out that this is a big threat just a few miles away?
Yeah, we've had congressional testimony here in Washington from some military leaders who have said that the base poses a security threat to the U.S., mainly from intelligence gathering. But I think the bigger strategic picture is that this base is located in a very strategic place along the Red Sea near the Bab el-Mandab, which is a strategic choke point which sees large amounts of oil shipping pass through there. And the concern is right now, the Iranians are seeking hegemony in the region and ultimately want to encircle and take over Saudi Arabia. And there are fears that this Chinese military base in Djibouti could be used by the Iranians as part of their effort. We've seen the Iranians threaten the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. They're supporting the Houthi rebels in Yemen to destabilize the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. And China has been working with a lot of rogue states. North Korea and Iran are the main ones. And so that's raised strategic concerns about this base in Djibouti.
Yeah, so Ibrahim, is Djibouti really a hostage to its geography? Because, you know, it's at a crossing point between Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Might it find itself drawn into a great game, or rather all these major players drawn into their territory, playing a big geopolitical game, and what will that mean for the region?
Well, Djibouti is very strategic. Through Djibouti, you have access to the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and you have access to the Middle East, about 20 miles away from Yemen. And of course, Djibouti is in mainland Africa, so it is very strategic. And this is exactly why all of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, except for now, the 3 permanent members I keep talking about, they are all establishing bases. First, they all come with the argument that they want to protect the trade routes. But my concern is about the internal peace and stability of the African continent. If you use Djibouti as a base for superpower diplomacy or superpower engagements with each other, then we feel threatened on the continent of Africa. We've seen a multiplicity of foreign bases established in the Sahel over the last 5 years. And there is still no progress in containing insurgent militant organizations. Okay, in northern Nigeria, the Nigerian authorities have significantly reduced the advancement of Boko Haram. But Libya is still very unstable. Mali, northern Mali is still very unstable. So these superpowers have to work together in this region. If they have interest, they are interested in the greater peace and stability of the African continent. And it's not about who is supporting which superpower in Yemen or in Saudi Arabia. So no one has the moral authority now to question the engagement of others. We in Africa, African activists are concerned about the greater implication for stability in case these superpowers on the continent clash.
Right.
That is going to have significant repercussion for us in Africa.
Okay, Bill, what is the likelihood of the US and China clashing in Africa, given that the Chinese just built that base very close to the US base?
Yeah, I don't see any problem there. The successive U.S. administrations here have sought to engage the Chinese military in a bid to build trust. That said, there is a lot of competition between the United States and China in the military sphere, and that's always a concern. The concern is that there could be some type of miscalculation. I'm sure that there's going to be mutual spying going on between those 2 bases in Djibouti. But I think overall, in terms of the African continent should welcome the U.S. presence. A lot of people seem to forget that China is a nuclear-armed communist dictatorship and that is challenging the international model, the U.S.-led international model, which is seeking to promote democracy and freedom and free markets. So I think there could be a clash of ideas more than any type of a military confrontation.
That's interesting because, you know, Ibrahim, this has been discussed for a long, long time. Many African leaders saying they much prefer the Chinese because there's usually no strings attached when they usually do business with them and so on, right? But doesn't Bill make a good point? China is a communist dictatorship and perhaps there's something far more nefarious that you're getting involved with when you're doing business with the Chinese, whereas with the US, they set certain preconditions.
Well, I don't know what benchmark Bill is using to define China as a communist dictatorship. And the regimes in Africa have been concerned more about those who engage them practically to survive. And I think over the last 50 years during the Cold War and even after the Cold War, the US has engaged and supported regimes that do not necessarily support liberal democracy, but regimes that to a greater extent support US interests have been supported. So we think the only authority that can judge the moral activities of others is the United Nations. And if China is pursuing its own interests in Africa and the US is doing the same, it is left with the African authorities, considering the genuine interests of their citizens, to engage at any level with any of the superpowers.
Right.
Yes, the US have been engaged with Africa for hundreds of years. We understand this. The Chinese are just coming, and they've been very aggressive in their approach. When I say aggressive, I want to say that they've been very practical and moving with a force that is, everyone is surprised by the Chinese engagement. Now, so many countries in Africa have China as their major source of import. We're talking about Djibouti. The major imports of Djibouti is coming from China. All of the countries in that region of East Africa, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, they all have major trade with China.
Right.
And China is accounting for the highest percent of trade that is coming to this country.
Okay, let me ask
it is
Bill,
based on these calculations.
Right, these are good points. Let me ask Bill. Bill, has the US maybe been asleep at the wheel because China's been doing the work on the ground? And Ibrahim makes a good point, doesn't he? The United States says some nice stuff, but over the years, it also has a horrible track record. General Mobutu was no friend of democracy, but supported by the United States. I mean, I guess to many Africans, they're all ugly imperialists, but who's going to help us the most? Isn't that a decent point, Bill?
Yeah, you know, it's been decades since the end of the Cold War when the strategic competition caused the U.S. to support some unsavory regimes. But I think overall the trend should be that the U.S. should do more to help promote democracy. In terms of the Chinese, their level of corruption is very real. They're buying up entire countries in Africa, and they're also taking a very mercantilist approach to the entire situation, basically trying to deplete the country of its resources without really helping to build up the country as is needed. So yeah, I think a lot more has to be done to help the continent. Hopefully, we will see the Chinese do that, but I'm not optimistic that under the current Chinese system that we will see a kind of selfless investment in the area. Again, they're looking for Chinese interests, primarily strategic interests. It's the Djibouti base is going to be used for power projection, perhaps even military warship visits, perhaps even nuclear submarine visits in the future.
Yeah, and Bill, as we sort of look at the big picture, before I ride this conversation out, do you believe that the Chinese are now activating, you know, sort of one click forward towards empire building, because they were quiet for a while on the political and military front in terms of foreign policy? Is this the beginning of China building an empire, Bill?
Absolutely. I think the Chinese are on the rise, and again, people should be concerned about this, again, because this is not a democratic system. This is not something that's going to promote freedom and stability. It's not something that's going to promote free markets and prosperity. That's my view.
Okay. Get the best deal you can and pay attention while you're doing so, I guess. Bill Gertz and Ibrahim Al-Bakri Nyai, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you very much.